Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of humanity's most brutal survival stories. A tale that makes every modern challenge seem trivial by comparison. So before you get comfortable, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we're doing here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how our community spans the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's journey back to a world where survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned. So picture this. 200,000 years ago, the world was a vastly different place. No cities, no farms, no safety nets. Just small bands of early humans scattered across harsh landscapes, each group fighting an uphill battle against extinction. These weren't the confident civilizations we'd eventually become. These were tiny clusters of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, huddled together against a world that seemed designed to kill them. Here's what's absolutely staggering. Of all the countless small hominin groups that existed during this period, 99% of them failed. They didn't just struggle, they vanished entirely. Their bloodlines ended, their knowledge died with them, their footsteps were erased by time. Only a precious few survived long enough to become our ancestors. So what made the difference? What separated the winners from the losers in humanity's most unforgiving era? Tonight we're going to uncover the brutal mathematics of early human survival. We'll explore why most groups were doomed from the start and how the rare survivors managed to beat odds that would make a lottery ticket look like a sure thing. This isn't just ancient history. This is the story of why you exist at all. The landscape 200,000 years ago was nothing like the world we know today. Imagine Africa, the cradle of our species, as a patchwork of opportunities and death traps. Lush river valleys that could sustain life for generations might dry up in a single brutal drought, forcing entire populations to migrate or die. Dense forests that provided shelter and food could be swept away by wildfires that raged for months. Coastal areas that offered rich marine resources might be claimed by rising seas or volcanic activity. For small hominin groups, this environmental chaos was a constant threat. Unlike large populations that could absorb losses and adapt to change, tiny bands of early humans operated with zero margin for error. A single bad decision, one failed hunt, or an unexpected natural disaster could spell the end for an entire genetic line that had survived for thousands of years. But the environment was just the beginning of their challenges. These groups faced what scientists call the minimum viable population problem. In simple terms, you need a certain number of individuals to maintain genetic diversity and social stability. Too few people, and you're walking a tightrope over extinction. Most small hominin groups hovered right at the edge of this threshold. They had just enough people to survive day to day, but not enough to weather major crises. When disease struck, when predators attacked, when resources became scarce, there simply weren't enough individuals to absorb the losses. A group of 30 might lose 10 members to illness and find themselves unable to hunt effectively or defend their territory. A band of 20 might have only 4 or 5 reproductive adults, creating a genetic bottleneck that would doom future generations. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Every death mattered exponentially more than it would in a larger population. The loss of a skilled hunter could mean starvation for everyone. The death of a medicine woman could leave the group defenseless against disease. When your entire society fits around a single campfire, there's no redundancy, no backup plan. Let's talk about the daily reality these groups faced. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your survival depends entirely on the people sleeping around you. There's no cavalry coming over the hill, no neighboring village to trade with, no safety net beyond your own small circle of family and friends. Your world extends only as far as your group can travel in a few days, and beyond that lies the unknown. Food was an obsession that dominated every waking moment. Unlike later agricultural societies that could store surplus, these groups lived meal to meal. A successful hunt meant celebration and full bellies. A failed hunt meant hunger and the gnawing anxiety that comes with dwindling resources. They couldn't simply go to another valley if game became scarce, because they didn't know what lay beyond their familiar territory. Moving meant risking everything on the chance that conditions would be better elsewhere. Water was another constant concern. Rivers and springs were lifelines that tied groups to specific locations, but they were also vulnerable points. During dry seasons, multiple groups might converge on the same water source, leading to competition and conflict. During wet seasons, flooding could destroy campsites and force desperate migrations. Weather was an enemy that could strike without warning. A sudden cold snap could kill the vulnerable members of the group, the very young and very old, who provided crucial knowledge and genetic diversity. A heat wave could make travel impossible and turn familiar landscapes into deadly obstacles. Storms could scatter the group, destroy their tools, and leave them exposed to predators. Speaking of predators, early humans were far from the apex predators we imagine. Large cats, hyenas, wild dogs, and other carnivores saw these small groups as convenient prey. Unlike today's humans, with our weapons and walls, these early groups had only basic tools and their wits. A single encounter with a pride of lions or a pack of hyenas could decimate a group that had survived for generations. But perhaps the most insidious threat was isolation itself. Small groups that became cut off from others faced what biologists call genetic drift and inbreeding depression. Without fresh genetic material from outside the group, children began to be born with defects and reduced fitness. The group's immune system became less diverse, making them vulnerable to diseases that might be minor inconveniences to larger populations. Social dynamics in these tiny communities were incredibly fragile. Everyone knew everyone intimately, which could be both a strength and a weakness. Strong leadership could guide the group through charismatic leader could leave themises, but the death of a Che rudderless and divided. Personal conflicts that might be manageable in larger societies could tear these small groups apart from within. Knowledge was another vulnerability. In groups where information was passed down orally, the death of key individuals could mean the loss of crucial survival skills. The elder who knew which plants were safe to eat, the hunter who understood animal migration patterns, the toolmaker who had perfected techniques passed down through generations. When these knowledge keepers died, they took irreplaceable information with them. The seasonal cycles that governed life 200,000 years ago were far more extreme than anything we experience today. Groups had to be experts at reading natural signs, predicting weather patterns, and timing their movements to coincide with animal migrations and plant harvests. A group that miscalculated could find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, facing starvation in a landscape that offered no second chances. Territory was both a necessity and a trap. Groups needed to claim and defend areas large enough to sustain them, but they also risked conflict with neighbors. Boundaries were fluid and often contested, leading to skirmishes that small groups could ill afford. The loss of even one or two fighters could leave the remaining members unable to protect their resources. Tool-making and technology, while advancing, were still primitive by our standards. A broken spear point or a lost fire-starting kit could mean the difference between life and death. Groups that lost their tools faced the daunting task of recreating them from memory, often under desperate circumstances. The learning curve was steep, and there was no room for extended trial and error. The role of chance cannot be overstated in these survival stories. A group might do everything right, make all the correct decisions, and still fall victim to random catastrophe. A rock slide could bury their shelter, a flash flood could sweep away their food stores, or a volcanic eruption could render their territory uninhabitable. In a world without insurance or government assistance, bad luck was often a death sentence. Disease was perhaps the most feared enemy of all. With no understanding of germs or hygiene, illnesses could spread rapidly through these close-knit groups. What started as a minor infection could become a plague that wiped out entire families. Groups had no choice but to care for their sick, but this often meant exposing healthy members to whatever was killing their loved ones. The psychological toll of this existence was enormous. Imagine living with the constant knowledge that your group could be extinct within a generation. Every decision carried life or death consequences, not just for yourself, but for your children and their children. The stress of this responsibility, combined with the physical demands of survival, created mental health challenges that these early humans had no framework to address. Yet despite all these overwhelming challenges, some groups did survive. They developed strategies, formed alliances, adapted to changing conditions, and passed their genes down to us. Their success wasn't guaranteed or easy. It was earned through countless small decisions, moments of courage, and strokes of luck that allowed them to beat the overwhelming odds stacked against them. The survivors weren't just lucky, they were strategic in ways that most groups never figured out. While 99% of small hominin bands clung to familiar territories and traditional methods, the successful 1% developed something revolutionary: flexibility. These winning groups understood that adaptation wasn't just about surviving change, it was about anticipating it. They developed what we might call early warning systems, reading subtle environmental cues that other groups missed entirely. When certain bird species began migrating earlier than usual, they knew drought was coming. When specific plants started flowering out of season, they prepared for harsh winters. This wasn't superstition, it was sophisticated pattern recognition that gave them crucial advantages. But environmental awareness was just one piece of the puzzle. The successful groups also cracked the code of social organization in ways that seem almost impossibly advanced for their time. While most bands operated as loose collections of families, the survivors created structured hierarchies with clearly defined roles. They had designated scouts who ranged far from the main group, hunter-gatherers who specialized in different types of food sources, and tool makers who constantly refined their techniques. More importantly, they developed redundancy systems. Instead of relying on a single expert for crucial skills, they ensured that multiple members of the group possessed essential knowledge. If the primary healer died, there were backup healers ready to step in. If the lead hunter was injured, others could take over without missing a beat. This redundancy was the difference between a temporary setback and total collapse. Communication was another area where successful groups excelled far beyond their contemporaries. They developed sophisticated signaling systems that allowed them to coordinate over vast distances. Smoke signals, rock cairns, and sound patterns that could travel for miles became their version of ancient telecommunications. When one part of the group discovered a rich food source or spotted danger, they could alert others instantly. These communication networks extended beyond individual groups. The most successful bands actively maintained contact with neighboring communities, creating loose confederations that shared information and resources. When times were good, they traded knowledge and materials. When crisis struck, they could call upon allies for assistance. This intergroup cooperation was revolutionary in an era when most communities viewed outsiders as threats. The survivors also mastered the art of strategic mobility. While unsuccessful groups either stayed too rigidly in place or wandered aimlessly, the survivors mapped their territories with scientific precision. They knew exactly how long it took to travel between water sources, which routes offered the best foraging opportunities, and where to find shelter during different seasons. Their movements weren't random migrations. They were calculated relocations based on deep environmental knowledge. Food storage and preservation became another critical advantage. While most groups consumed everything immediately, the survivors developed techniques for extending the life of their resources. They learned to smoke meat, dry fruits, and even create primitive caches hidden throughout their territory. This food security allowed them to weather shortages that decimated other groups. Medical knowledge was perhaps their most closely guarded secret. The successful groups didn't just treat injuries and illnesses, they prevented them. They understood quarantine procedures long before the concept had a name, isolating sick members to prevent the spread of disease. They developed herbal remedies that actually worked, not through magic, but through careful observation of which plants produced genuine healing effects. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. The survivors weren't just reactive, they were proactive planners who thought generations ahead. They established what we might call succession protocols, ensuring that crucial knowledge was passed down not just to their own children, but to multiple young people in the group. They created apprenticeship systems where skills were taught through intensive mentorship rather than casual observation. These groups also developed sophisticated mating strategies that prevented the genetic problems that doomed smaller bands. They established complex kinship rules that prevented inbreeding while maintaining group cohesion. Some even developed exchange systems with distant groups, essentially creating ancient genetic diversity programs that kept their bloodlines healthy across generations. Resource management among successful groups was remarkably advanced. They practiced what we would now recognize as sustainable harvesting, taking only what they needed and leaving enough for regeneration. They rotated their hunting grounds to prevent overexploitation and developed seasonal calendars that optimized their resource extraction throughout the year. The psychological aspect of survival was equally important. Successful groups developed cultural practices that maintained morale and group identity during the darkest times. They created rituals that reinforced social bonds, storytelling traditions that preserved important information, and decision-making processes that prevented the internal conflicts that tore other groups apart. Leadership in these successful communities was fundamentally different from the authoritarian structures we might expect. Instead of single dominant leaders, they developed council systems where different individuals took charge based on the situation at hand. The best tracker led during migrations, the most skilled healer directed medical decisions, and the wisest elder guided long-term planning. This distributed leadership prevented the catastrophic failures that occurred when dominant leaders made poor decisions or died unexpectedly. Risk management was another area where survivors excelled. They never put all their eggs in one basket, literally or figuratively. If they discovered a rich food source, they didn't camp there permanently and exploit it until depletion. Instead, they incorporated it into a rotation system that included multiple backup options. They maintained several potential shelter sites, multiple water sources, and diverse food procurement strategies. The successful groups also developed what we might call early warning networks. They established relationships with neighboring communities, not for trade or alliance, but specifically for information sharing about threats. When one group encountered a dangerous predator, aggressive neighbors, or environmental hazard, word spread quickly through these networks, allowing other communities to prepare or avoid the danger entirely. Technology development in successful groups followed patterns that would be familiar to modern innovators. They didn't just use tools, they constantly refined them. Each generation improved upon the designs of their predecessors, creating increasingly sophisticated implements. More importantly, they experimented systematically, testing new designs under controlled conditions before betting their lives on untested technology. The survivors understood something that most groups never grasped. Individual survival was meaningless without group survival, and group survival was impossible without individual excellence. They created cultures that celebrated personal achievement while maintaining collective responsibility. Heroes were honored not for personal glory, but for contributions to group welfare. These successful communities also developed sophisticated conflict resolution mechanisms. In groups where everyone's survival depended on cooperation, internal disputes could be fatal. The survivors created formal processes for handling disagreements, mediating conflicts, and maintaining social harmony even under extreme stress. They understood that a group torn apart by internal strife was just as doomed as one facing external threats. Perhaps most remarkably, the successful groups developed long-term thinking that extended far beyond immediate survival. They made decisions based not just on current conditions, but on projections of future challenges and opportunities. This strategic foresight allowed them to position themselves advantageously for changes that blindsided other communities. The mathematics of their success become clearer when we examine these strategies in detail. While random groups had perhaps a 1 in 100 chance of survival, groups that implemented even a few of these advanced strategies dramatically improved their odds. Communities that mastered multiple survival techniques didn't just survive, they thrived in conditions that destroyed their neighbors. But implementing these strategies required something that most groups lacked entirely: the vision to see beyond immediate needs and the discipline to invest in long-term advantages even when resources were scarce. It meant allocating precious time and energy to activities that didn't provide immediate benefits but would prove crucial when crisis struck. The successful groups also understood something that modern survival experts would recognize immediately. Diversification wasn't just smart, it was essential. While failing communities specialized narrowly, putting all their expertise into hunting large game or gathering specific plants, the survivors spread their skills across every possible survival domain. They became generalists in an era when specialization seemed like the obvious path. This diversification extended to their knowledge base in ways that seem almost impossible for such small groups. They maintained experts in weather prediction, animal behavior, plant identification, tool making, medicine, navigation, and social diplomacy. But here's the crucial difference. These weren't separate individuals, each holding one skill. These were cross-trained community members who understood multiple disciplines and could step into different roles when needed. The failing groups made a critical error that doomed them from the start. They treated survival as a series of separate challenges to be tackled individually. Food procurement was one problem, shelter was another, defense was a third. The successful groups understood that everything was connected. Their approach was holistic, recognizing that every decision rippled through every aspect of their existence. When successful groups chose a campsite, they weren't just looking for immediate shelter. They evaluated water access, food availability, defensive positions, escape routes, raw material sources, and proximity to other resources. A location might offer excellent hunting but poor visibility for spotting threats. Another might provide perfect defense but limited access to tool-making materials. The survivors learned to optimize for multiple variables simultaneously. This systems thinking extended to their daily routines in ways that gave them enormous advantages over their competitors. While other groups focused on immediate needs, the survivors built redundancy into everything they did. When they went out to hunt, some members simultaneously gathered backup food sources. When they collected water, they also scouted for alternative sources. Every activity served multiple purposes. The psychological differences between successful and failing groups become apparent when we examine how they dealt with setbacks. Failing communities treated disasters as existential threats that required desperate, often destructive responses. When food became scarce, they would exhaust themselves in frantic hunting expeditions that often made the situation worse. When members died, they would fall into paralyzing grief that prevented effective decision-making. Successful groups developed what we might recognize as early forms of crisis management protocols. They had predetermined responses to different types of emergencies, established chains of command for crisis situations, and maintained emergency resource caches that could sustain them through temporary hardships. More importantly, they treated setbacks as information rather than catastrophes. When a hunting expedition failed, successful groups analyzed what went wrong and adjusted their strategies accordingly. When they encountered new threats, they studied them systematically to develop countermeasures. This learning orientation meant that each challenge made them stronger rather than wearing them down progressively. The role of innovation in successful groups was fundamentally different from what we might expect. While failing communities either clung rigidly to traditional methods or adopted changes haphazardly, the survivors developed systematic approaches to innovation. They experimented constantly, but they did so in controlled ways that minimized risk to the overall group. New tools were tested extensively before being adopted. New techniques were practiced by volunteers before being taught to essential personnel. New territories were scouted thoroughly before the group committed to relocation. This careful approach to change allowed them to benefit from innovation while avoiding the disasters that befell groups who adopted untested strategies under pressure. Social innovation was equally important. Successful groups constantly refined their internal structures to improve efficiency and reduce conflict. They developed increasingly sophisticated methods for distributing resources, assigning tasks, and making collective decisions. These weren't ancient democracies, but they were remarkably advanced forms of collaborative governance that prevented the authoritarian failures that destroyed other communities. The successful groups also mastered something that most communities never understood. Information was their most valuable resource, more precious than food, tools, or territory. They developed systematic methods for collecting, storing, and transmitting knowledge that went far beyond simple storytelling around campfires. They created what we might recognize as early databases, using complex systems of symbols, songs, and stories to encode crucial survival information. Navigation routes were preserved in epic poems that could be recited accurately across generations. Seasonal patterns were embedded in ritual calendars that ensured important timing was never forgotten. Medical knowledge was encoded in elaborate ceremonies that made the information memorable and difficult to corrupt. But information was only valuable if it could be accessed when needed. Successful groups developed redundant storage systems that prevented crucial knowledge from being lost when key individuals died. They cross-trained multiple members in essential skills and created verification systems that prevented the corruption of important information over time. The territorial strategies of successful groups reveal another layer of their sophistication. While failing communities either defended fixed territories rigidly or wandered without strategic purpose, the survivors developed fluid territorial concepts that adapted to changing conditions. They maintained primary territories that provided their basic needs, but they also established secondary territories that could serve as fallback positions during emergencies. These secondary territories weren't just backup camping spots. They were fully developed alternative ecosystems, complete with cached resources, established shelter sites, and detailed knowledge of local conditions. When primary territories became untenable due to drought, predation, or competition, successful groups could relocate to their backup territories and continue thriving with minimal disruption. The successful groups also developed sophisticated intelligence networks that extended far beyond their immediate territories. They maintained relationships with distant communities specifically for information gathering purposes. These weren't military alliances or trading partnerships. They were early warning systems that provided crucial advance notice of threats and opportunities. When distant groups encountered new predators experienced unusual weather patterns, or discovered rich resource areas. This information flowed through networks that could span hundreds of miles. Successful communities often knew about challenges and opportunities long before they directly encountered them, giving them enormous strategic advantages over isolated groups. Resource allocation within successful groups followed principles that would be familiar to modern economists. They understood concepts like investment, depreciation, and opportunity cost, even if they lacked the vocabulary to describe them. When resources were abundant, they invested heavily in tool improvement, skill development, and territorial expansion. When resources were scarce, they focused on core survival needs while maintaining critical long-term investments. This economic thinking extended to their labor allocation strategies. Successful groups understood that some activities provided immediate returns, while others required long-term investment for future payoffs. They balanced these needs carefully, ensuring that immediate survival requirements were met while still investing in activities that would provide advantages in the future. The medical practices of successful groups were remarkably advanced for their time. They developed systematic approaches to injury treatment, disease prevention, and health maintenance that went far beyond the folk remedies used by most communities. They understood quarantine procedures, practiced basic surgery, and maintained sophisticated pharmacological knowledge about plant-based medicines. But their most important medical innovation was preventive care. Rather than simply treating problems after they occurred, successful groups developed lifestyle practices that prevented many health issues from arising in the first place. They understood nutrition, exercise, hygiene, and stress management in ways that kept their members healthier and more capable than members of other groups. The reproductive strategies of successful groups were equally sophisticated. They understood genetics intuitively, developing complex rules about mating partners that prevented inbreeding while maintaining group cohesion. They established exchange programs with distant communities that brought fresh genetic material into their bloodlines without disrupting their social structures. These groups also developed advanced childcare systems that ensured high survival rates for their young. They understood the importance of early childhood education, starting the training of essential skills from the earliest possible age. They created protective environments that shielded children from dangers while still allowing them to develop the independence and skills they would need as adults. The communication systems developed by successful groups were perhaps their most remarkable achievement. They created languages that were optimized for their survival needs, with extensive vocabularies for describing environmental conditions, resource locations, and threat assessments. These weren't primitive grunt and point systems. They were sophisticated languages capable of conveying complex technical and strategic information. But communication wasn't just about language. Successful groups developed multimodal communication systems that combined verbal, visual, and symbolic elements. They could convey complex messages using combinations of spoken words, hand signals, drawn symbols, and environmental markers. These redundant communication systems ensured that crucial information could be transmitted even under difficult conditions. The training and education systems within successful groups were remarkably comprehensive. Every member of the community was expected to master certain basic skills while also developing specialized expertise in at least one critical area. This created communities where everyone was competent at essential tasks, while also maintaining the deep expertise needed for complex challenges. But perhaps most importantly, successful groups understood that survival wasn't just about overcoming immediate challenges. It was about building sustainable systems that could thrive across generations. They made decisions based on how those choices would affect not just themselves, but their children and grandchildren. This long-term thinking was the ultimate factor that separated the survivors from the forgotten failures of human prehistory. The successful groups discovered something that seems almost counterintuitive in a world where every calorie mattered. They learned to deliberately maintain excess capacity. While failing communities operated at maximum efficiency, using every available person for immediate survival tasks, the survivors always kept some members in reserve. This wasn't laziness or poor resource management. It was strategic redundancy that paid enormous dividends when crisis struck. Imagine a group of 30 people where 25 were dedicated to daily survival tasks and 5 were designated as rapid response specialists. When a predator threatened the camp, those 5 could mobilize instantly while the others continued essential activities. When someone was injured during a hunt, reserve members could step in without disrupting the entire operation. This buffer capacity meant that emergencies didn't cascade into community-wide disasters. The mathematical advantage becomes clear when you consider the alternatives. A group operating at full capacity had no surge capability. When extra effort was needed, it came at the expense of other critical activities. Food procurement suffered when everyone was focused on defense. Shelter maintenance was neglected during intensive hunting periods. The survivors understood that sustainable systems required built-in flexibility, but maintaining excess capacity required something that most groups couldn't achieve: productivity levels that exceeded immediate needs. The successful communities had to be so efficient at basic survival that they could afford to keep some members available for non-routine tasks. This efficiency came from relentless optimization of their core processes. While other groups hunted haphazardly, the survivors developed systematic approaches that maximized return on effort. They studied animal behavior patterns so intensively that they could predict movement with remarkable accuracy. They identified the optimal times and locations for different types of prey. They developed hunting techniques that required fewer people to achieve the same results, freeing up others for different activities. Food processing in successful groups was similarly optimized. They developed techniques for extracting maximum nutrition from available resources. They learned to utilize parts of animals that other groups discarded. They discovered preparation methods that made tough or bitter foods palatable. These efficiency gains meant they needed less time and fewer people to meet their nutritional requirements. The survivors also mastered what we might call logistical coordination. Moving a group of 20 to 50 people across varied terrain while maintaining security, carrying essential supplies, and caring for the young and elderly was an enormously complex operation. Most groups handled this through trial and error, learning painful lessons through repeated failures. Successful communities developed systematic approaches to group movement that minimized risk and maximized efficiency. They established standard formations for different types of terrain. They designated specific individuals responsible for navigation, security, supply management, and group cohesion. They practiced these movements during peaceful periods so that relocations could be executed smoothly, even under pressure. Their scouting systems were particularly sophisticated. Rather than sending single individuals to explore new areas, they deployed teams with complementary skills. A typical scouting party might include someone expert in reading animal signs, another skilled at identifying edible plants, a third capable of assessing defensive positions, and a fourth specialized in weather prediction. These teams could evaluate potential territories comprehensively in a fraction of the time required by generalist scouts. The information gathered by these scouting teams was processed systematically. Successful groups developed standardized methods for describing terrain, resources, threats, and opportunities. They created what amounted to detailed intelligence reports that could guide group decisions with remarkable precision. This systematic approach to reconnaissance gave them enormous advantages over groups that relied on casual observation and intuition. Weather prediction among successful groups reached levels that seem almost supernatural from our modern perspective. They understood atmospheric patterns so deeply that they could forecast conditions days or even weeks in advance. This wasn't mysticism, it was sophisticated pattern recognition based on careful observation of environmental indicators that most people never noticed. They tracked the behavior of insects, birds, and small mammals as leading indicators of weather changes. They monitored cloud formations, wind patterns, and atmospheric pressure changes using techniques passed down through generations of careful observers. They recognized that certain plant responses preceded specific weather patterns by predictable intervals. This meteorological expertise allowed successful groups to position themselves advantageously for changing conditions. They could seek shelter before storms arrived, move to higher ground before floods, and locate water sources before droughts intensified. While other groups were constantly reacting to weather emergencies, the survivors were proactively managing their exposure to environmental risks. The psychological sophistication of successful groups was equally remarkable. They understood that morale and mental health were survival necessities, not luxuries. They developed systematic approaches to maintaining group cohesion and individual motivation, even during the most challenging periods. They created ritual structures that provided psychological anchors during uncertain times. Regular ceremonies marked important transitions and reinforced group identity. Storytelling sessions served multiple purposes, preserving important information while also providing entertainment and emotional release. Music and dance weren't frivolous activities. They were essential tools for maintaining mental health and social bonds. Conflict resolution within successful groups followed principles that modern psychologists would recognize as remarkably advanced. They understood that unresolved disputes could destroy communities from within, so they developed systematic approaches to addressing disagreements before they escalated into destructive conflicts. They established formal processes for hearing different perspectives, mediating disputes, and reaching mutually acceptable resolutions. They recognized that some conflicts stemmed from resource scarcity, while others arose from personality clashes or cultural differences. They developed different intervention strategies appropriate for different types of disputes. Most importantly, they understood that preventing conflicts was more effective than resolving them after they occurred. They structured their communities to minimize the sources of tension that destroyed other groups. They established clear protocols for resource distribution, task allocation, and decision-making that reduced ambiguity and competition. The successful groups also developed sophisticated approaches to leadership development that ensured continuity even when key individuals died or became incapacitated. Rather than relying on single dominant leaders, they cultivated leadership skills across multiple community members. This distributed leadership model provided resilience that communities dependent on individual strongmen could never achieve. They identified leadership potential early and provided systematic training to develop those capabilities. Young people who showed aptitude for specific skills received intensive mentorship from community experts. This wasn't casual apprenticeship. It was deliberate leadership development designed to create multiple capable leaders in each critical area. The succession planning in successful groups was particularly sophisticated. They didn't wait for leaders to die before identifying replacements. They maintained clear lines of succession for every critical role and ensured that potential successors were prepared to assume responsibility immediately when needed. Training systems within successful groups were remarkably comprehensive and systematic. Every community member was expected to achieve competency in a core set of survival skills while also developing specialized expertise in at least one critical area. This created communities where everyone could contribute meaningfully while also maintaining the deep knowledge needed for complex challenges. The basic skills curriculum was extensive. Everyone learned fundamental techniques for food procurement, shelter construction, tool making, navigation, first aid, and group coordination. These weren't superficial introductions. They were intensive training programs that continued until individuals achieved genuine competency. Specialized training was equally rigorous. Individuals who showed aptitude for specific skills received advanced instruction that could take years to complete. Master toolmakers passed down techniques through intensive apprenticeships. Expert trackers shared subtle knowledge that took decades to accumulate. Skilled healers transmitted complex medical knowledge through careful mentorship programs. But the most remarkable aspect of these training systems was their redundancy. Successful groups ensured that critical knowledge was held by multiple individuals. They never allowed essential skills to rest with single experts who could take irreplaceable knowledge with them when they died. The tool-making capabilities of successful groups were far more advanced than those of their contemporaries. While other communities created tools haphazardly as needs arose, the survivors developed systematic approaches to tool design, manufacture, and maintenance that gave them significant technological advantages. They established standardized designs for essential tools that optimized performance while minimizing manufacturing complexity. They developed production techniques that allowed multiple craftsmen to create interchangeable components. They maintained quality control standards that ensured tools met performance requirements consistently. Most importantly, they developed systematic approaches to tool improvement. Each generation of toolmakers built upon the innovations of their predecessors, creating increasingly sophisticated implements. They experimented with new materials, refined manufacturing techniques, and developed specialized tools for specific tasks. The maintenance and repair capabilities of successful groups were equally advanced. They understood that tools were valuable assets that needed to be preserved and maintained. They developed techniques for extending tool life, repairing damaged implements, and recycling materials from worn-out equipment. The resource management strategies employed by successful groups were sophisticated enough to prevent the overexploitation that doomed many of their contemporaries. They understood that sustainable resource use required balancing immediate needs with long-term availability. They developed harvesting protocols that ensured renewable resources could regenerate effectively. They practiced rotational harvesting that allowed different resource areas to recover while others were being utilized. They established quotas that prevented overexploitation of critical resources. They developed techniques for enhancing the productivity of natural resources through careful management practices. The successful groups also understood the importance of resource diversification. Rather than depending heavily on single resource types, they developed broad portfolios of food sources, raw materials, and other necessities. This diversification protected them from the catastrophic shortages that occurred when specialized groups lost access to their primary resources. Water management among successful groups was particularly sophisticated. They understood that water access was often the limiting factor that determined group survival, so they developed comprehensive strategies for locating, accessing, and conserving water resources. They maintained detailed knowledge of water sources throughout their territories, including seasonal variations in availability and quality. They developed techniques for locating hidden water sources that less knowledgeable groups might miss entirely. They created methods for purifying questionable water that reduced the risk of waterborne illnesses. Most importantly, they developed water storage and conservation techniques that allowed them to maintain supplies during dry periods. They created containers from animal skins and plant materials that could preserve water for extended periods. They established protocols for water rationing that ensured fair distribution while maintaining adequate reserves. The territorial management strategies of successful groups were far more sophisticated than the simple territorial defense practiced by most communities. They understood that territory was a complex resource that needed to be managed strategically rather than simply defended aggressively. They developed detailed maps of their territories that identified resource locations, seasonal patterns, travel routes, and potential threats. These weren't crude sketches. They were comprehensive territorial databases that captured essential information about every significant feature within their range. They established sophisticated protocols for territorial expansion that balanced the benefits of additional resources against the costs of defending larger areas. They understood that territories could become too large to defend effectively, so they optimized their territorial size for their group's capabilities. Most importantly, they developed flexible territorial concepts that could adapt to changing conditions. When environmental changes made portions of their territory less valuable, they could contract their boundaries without losing essential resources. When opportunities arose to expand into valuable new areas, they could do so strategically rather than haphazardly. The alliance and diplomacy strategies employed by successful groups were perhaps their most sophisticated innovations. While most communities viewed outsiders as threats to be avoided or enemies to be fought, the survivors understood that selective cooperation could provide enormous advantages. They developed systematic approaches to identifying potential allies and assessing the risks and benefits of different types of relationships. They established protocols for initial contact with unknown groups that minimized the risk of conflict while maximizing opportunities for beneficial cooperation. They created trade relationships that provided access to resources and materials not available in their own territories. They established information sharing agreements that provided early warning of threats and opportunities. They developed mutual assistance pacts that could provide crucial support during emergencies. But perhaps most importantly, they maintained these relationships over extended periods through consistent, reliable behavior. They understood that trust was a valuable asset that needed to be earned and preserved through repeated positive interactions. The successful groups also developed sophisticated strategies for managing the risks associated with intergroup contact. They understood that contact with outsiders could introduce diseases, conflicts, and cultural disruptions that could threaten group stability. They established quarantine procedures for managing contact with potentially diseased groups. They developed protocols for managing cultural exchanges that preserved their own essential traditions while adopting beneficial innovations from other communities. They created conflict avoidance strategies that prevented minor disagreements from escalating into destructive warfare. The intelligence gathering capabilities of successful groups were remarkably advanced for their era. They understood that information about environmental conditions, resource availability, and potential threats was crucial for making good survival decisions. They developed systematic approaches to collecting, analyzing, and disseminating intelligence that gave them significant advantages over less organized groups. They established networks of informants and scouts that provided comprehensive coverage of their operational areas. They created methods for verifying information that reduced the risk of making decisions based on inaccurate intelligence. Most importantly, they developed institutional memory systems that preserved important intelligence across generations. They understood that information was only valuable if it remained accessible when needed, so they created redundant storage systems that prevented crucial knowledge from being lost when key individuals died. The crisis management capabilities that separated successful groups from their doomed contemporaries were perhaps their most important achievement. They understood that survival wasn't just about preventing crises, it was about managing them effectively when they inevitably occurred. They developed comprehensive crisis response protocols that could be implemented rapidly when emergencies arose. They established clear chains of command for crisis situations that prevented the confusion and paralysis that destroyed other groups during critical moments. They maintained emergency resource caches that could sustain them through temporary hardships. But most importantly, they developed the psychological resilience needed to function effectively under extreme stress. They understood that panic and despair were as dangerous as any external threat, so they created cultural practices that maintained morale and decision-making capability even during the darkest periods. These crisis management capabilities were tested repeatedly throughout their existence, and each successful response strengthened their systems and increased their confidence. While other groups were destroyed by their first major crisis, the survivors emerged from each challenge stronger and more capable than before. The mathematical advantages enjoyed by these successful groups became cumulative over time. Each innovation, each system improvement, each crisis successfully managed increased their survival odds relative to their contemporaries. While random groups faced essentially static survival probabilities, the survivors were constantly improving their position in the survival game. This process of continuous improvement was perhaps their greatest achievement. They understood that survival wasn't a destination to be reached, but a process to be optimized continuously. They never became complacent, never assumed that current success guaranteed future survival. They maintained the innovative drive and adaptive capacity that separated them from the static communities that surrounded them. The legacy of these successful groups extends far beyond their immediate survival. They developed the cultural, technological, and social innovations that became the foundation for all subsequent human achievements. The sophisticated systems they created for managing resources, coordinating group activities, and adapting to environmental challenges became the building blocks of human civilization. Their greatest contribution wasn't just surviving the brutal selection pressures of 200,000 years ago. It was developing the systematic approaches to survival that could be transmitted to future generations and adapted to new challenges. They created the cultural DNA that allowed humanity to spread across the globe and eventually dominate every terrestrial environment. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that intelligence and cooperation could overcome seemingly impossible odds. In a world where random chance and brute force seem to determine survival, they proved that systematic thinking, careful planning, and collaborative effort could create sustainable advantages that persisted across generations. The story of these successful groups isn't just ancient history. It's a masterclass in survival strategy that remains relevant today. The principles they discovered, the systems they developed, and the mindset they cultivated continue to separate survivors from victims in every challenging situation. Their legacy lives on in every human community that faces adversity with systematic preparation, collaborative effort, and unwavering determination to not just survive, but thrive. The question that haunts researchers today is whether these survival strategies could have emerged purely by chance, or if they represent genuine evolutionary leaps in human cognitive development. When we examine the archaeological record, we find something remarkable. The successful groups weren't just lucky survivors, they were active innovators who fundamentally changed what it meant to be human. Consider the timeline more carefully. 200,000 years ago, the cognitive gap between successful and failing groups was already enormous. While unsuccessful communities were still operating with essentially reactive survival strategies, the survivors had developed what we can only describe as strategic thinking. They were planning multiple moves ahead in the survival game, anticipating challenges that hadn't yet materialized. This cognitive revolution didn't happen overnight. It required generations of accumulated knowledge and systematic refinement of survival techniques. But here's what's truly staggering about the timeline. The groups that developed these advanced strategies did so independently in different regions, facing completely different environmental challenges. Yet they all converged on remarkably similar solutions. In East Africa, successful groups were developing sophisticated water management systems to cope with unpredictable rainfall patterns. In Southern Africa, other survivors were creating complex seasonal migration routes that optimized resource access throughout the year. In North Africa, different communities were mastering the art of intergroup diplomacy to manage territorial disputes peacefully. These weren't isolated innovations. They were systematic approaches to survival that required fundamental changes in how these early humans thought about their relationship with the environment and each other. The successful groups had made a crucial conceptual leap that most of their contemporaries never achieved. They stopped thinking of themselves as victims of circumstance and started thinking of themselves as agents who could actively shape their survival outcomes. This shift in mindset had profound implications for every aspect of their existence. When facing food shortages, instead of simply working harder to find more food, they analyzed the underlying causes of scarcity and developed strategies to prevent future shortages. When encountering new predators, instead of simply avoiding them, they studied their behavior patterns and developed countermeasures that allowed continued use of valuable territories. The psychological transformation that accompanied these strategic innovations was equally significant. Successful groups developed what modern psychologists would recognize as an internal locus of control. They believed that their actions could meaningfully influence their outcomes, and this belief became a self-fulfilling prophecy that drove them to develop increasingly sophisticated survival capabilities. But this psychological shift came with costs that many groups couldn't bear. Taking responsibility for survival outcomes meant accepting the burden of constantly making life and death decisions. It meant living with the knowledge that poor choices could doom not just themselves, but their children and grandchildren. The psychological pressure was enormous, and many individuals and groups cracked under this responsibility. The successful groups developed cultural mechanisms for managing this psychological burden. They created decision-making processes that distributed responsibility across multiple individuals. They established rituals that provided psychological release from the constant pressure of survival planning. They developed philosophical frameworks that helped individuals cope with the weight of collective responsibility. These cultural innovations were just as important as their technological and strategic advances. Human beings aren't machines that can operate under constant stress indefinitely. The successful groups understood that maintaining psychological health was essential for maintaining the clear thinking needed for good survival decisions. They developed what we might recognize as early forms of mental health treatment. They created social roles for individuals who couldn't handle the stress of direct survival responsibilities, but could contribute in other ways. They established practices for managing grief, fear, and despair that prevented these emotions from paralyzing the group during critical moments. The social structures within successful groups reflected this sophisticated understanding of human psychology. They created hierarchies that provided clear guidance without crushing individual initiative. They established systems of rewards and recognition that motivated excellence while maintaining group cohesion. They developed methods for handling social deviance that protected group stability without resorting to wasteful expulsions or executions. These social innovations were particularly crucial during periods of resource scarcity, when competition for survival resources could easily tear communities apart from within. The successful groups understood that internal conflict was often more dangerous than external threats, so they invested heavily in maintaining social harmony even during the most challenging times. But perhaps their most remarkable social innovation was the development of institutional knowledge systems that transcended individual mortality. While failing groups lost crucial information when key individuals died, the survivors created redundant knowledge storage systems that preserved essential information across generations. They developed elaborate oral traditions that encoded survival information in memorable stories, songs, and rituals. They created apprenticeship systems that ensured multiple individuals possessed critical skills. They established verification procedures that prevented the corruption of important information over time. These knowledge preservation systems weren't just practical necessities, they were profound cultural achievements that fundamentally changed the nature of human existence. For the first time in evolutionary history, a species had developed the ability to accumulate knowledge across generations in ways that weren't limited by individual memory capacity or lifespan. This capacity for cumulative cultural evolution gave successful groups enormous advantages over their contemporaries. Each generation could build upon the achievements of their predecessors, creating an accelerating cycle of innovation and improvement that eventually led to the technological and social complexity we associate with modern human civilization. The environmental management strategies developed by successful groups were equally revolutionary. While failing communities treated their environment as a collection of resources to be exploited until exhausted, the survivors developed sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that allowed sustainable resource use over extended periods. They understood concepts like carrying capacity, renewable versus non-renewable resources, and the importance of maintaining biodiversity within their territories. They developed harvesting protocols that maintained the long-term productivity of their resource base while meeting immediate survival needs. These weren't abstract environmental philosophies. They were practical survival strategies based on careful observation of ecological relationships. The successful groups had learned through bitter experience that overexploiting resources led to catastrophic shortages that could destroy communities that had survived for generations. They developed monitoring systems that provided early warning of resource depletion or environmental degradation. They established protocols for shifting resource use patterns when monitoring indicated that current practices weren't sustainable. They created restoration techniques that could repair damaged ecosystems and restore productivity to overused areas. But their most sophisticated environmental innovation was the development of what we might recognize as early forms of ecosystem management. Rather than simply harvesting wild resources, they began actively managing their territories to enhance productivity and sustainability. They developed controlled burning techniques that maintained grasslands and prevented catastrophic wildfires. They created water management systems that enhanced the availability and reliability of water resources. They established wildlife management practices that maintained healthy populations of important prey species. These ecosystem management practices required sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and long-term thinking that most groups never developed. They represented a fundamental shift from passive resource exploitation to active environmental stewardship that required significant investments of time and effort with delayed payoffs. The successful groups were willing to make these investments because they understood that short-term sacrifices could generate enormous long-term benefits. They had developed time horizons that extended far beyond immediate survival needs to encompass the welfare of future generations. This long-term thinking was perhaps their most important innovation. While failing groups were trapped in cycles of crisis and recovery that prevented systematic improvement, the survivors had broken free from purely reactive survival patterns to develop proactive strategies that improved their situation over time. They understood that survival wasn't just about making it through the next crisis. It was about building sustainable systems that could thrive across generations. They made decisions based on how those choices would affect not just themselves, but their children and grandchildren. This generational thinking required sophisticated planning capabilities that most groups never developed. It meant maintaining detailed mental models of how current actions would influence future outcomes. It required the ability to sacrifice immediate benefits for long-term advantages, even when those advantages might not be realized for decades. The mathematical implications of this long-term thinking were profound. While groups focused on short-term survival faced essentially random survival probabilities that remained constant over time, the survivors were systematically improving their odds with each generation. Each innovation, each system improvement, each crisis successfully managed increased their survival advantage relative to their contemporaries. Over time, these accumulated advantages created survival probabilities that were orders of magnitude better than those faced by random groups. The compounding effects of these systematic improvements meant that successful groups weren't just slightly better at survival than their contemporaries. They were operating in completely different survival paradigms. While most groups were still struggling with basic day-to-day survival challenges, the survivors had moved beyond survival to early forms of prosperity. They had achieved something that seems almost impossible in the harsh world of 200,000 years ago. They had created margins of safety that allowed them to invest in activities that didn't provide immediate survival benefits, but enhanced their long-term prospects. They could afford to experiment with new technologies because they had sufficient resources to absorb the costs of failed experiments. They could invest in education and training because they had enough productive capacity to support individuals who weren't directly contributing to immediate survival needs. They could maintain larger populations because they had developed more efficient resource utilization techniques that could support more individuals within the same territorial areas. They could take calculated risks because they had built sufficient redundancy into their systems to absorb occasional failures without catastrophic consequences. This transition from survival to early prosperity was perhaps the most important threshold in human evolutionary history. It marked the point at which human communities became capable of sustained growth and development rather than simply maintaining equilibrium with their environment. The successful groups had discovered something that would define human civilization for the next 200,000 years. Systematic innovation and long-term planning could create sustainable advantages that accumulated over time to produce outcomes that seemed impossible from purely individual perspectives. They had proven that intelligence and cooperation could overcome seemingly impossible odds, and they had developed the cultural and technological foundations that would eventually allow their descendants to spread across the globe and dominate every terrestrial environment. But perhaps most importantly, they had demonstrated that human survival wasn't just about individual strength or luck. It was about building communities that could think systematically, plan strategically, and work together effectively to create sustainable advantages that persisted across generations. The legacy of these remarkable communities extends far beyond their immediate survival success. They created the template for human civilization itself, developing the fundamental principles of resource management, social organization, and technological innovation that continue to define human societies today. Their story reminds us that our current dominance as a species wasn't inevitable or guaranteed. It was earned through the systematic efforts of countless generations who refused to accept the brutal survival odds that nature imposed upon them. They chose instead to develop the intelligence, cooperation, and long-term thinking that transformed humanity from just another struggling species into the planet's dominant life form. The mathematical reality remains stark and humbling. 99% of small hominin groups failed to survive the challenges of 200,000 years ago. But that precious 1% who succeeded didn't just survive. They thrived in ways that created the foundation for everything that followed in human history. Their innovations in crisis management, resource allocation, social organization, and long-term planning became the building blocks of human civilization. Their commitment to systematic improvement and collaborative effort established the cultural patterns that would eventually lead to agriculture, cities, writing, and all the technological achievements that define modern human society. Understanding their success isn't just an academic exercise in prehistoric archaeology. It's a masterclass in survival strategy that remains relevant whenever human communities face existential challenges. The principles they discovered, the systems they developed, and the mindset they cultivated continue to separate survivors from victims in every challenging situation humans encounter. Their greatest lesson isn't about the specific techniques they used to overcome the brutal selection pressures of their era. It's about the fundamental approach they took to survival itself. They refused to accept their circumstances as fixed constraints and instead developed systematic methods for improving their situation over time. They proved that even when facing seemingly impossible odds, intelligent communities that work together systematically and think beyond immediate needs can create sustainable advantages that persist across generations. Their legacy lives on in every human community that faces adversity with preparation, cooperation, and determination to not just survive, but build something better for future generations. The groups that managed to crack this survival code didn't do it through luck or accident. They developed what we can only describe as systematic approaches to the impossible. While their doomed contemporaries were still thinking one meal ahead, the survivors had learned to think in terms of survival systems that could function across seasons, across years, across generations. Consider the staggering complexity of what they achieved. These weren't large civilizations with specialized roles and accumulated wealth. These were tiny bands of people operating with the slimmest possible margins, yet they managed to create redundancy, maintain quality control, and invest in long-term improvements that wouldn't pay off for decades. The successful groups understood something that modern survival experts would immediately recognize. Single points of failure are death sentences. While failing communities organized themselves around individual experts, the survivors created overlapping competencies that could absorb the loss of any single person without catastrophic consequences. When their best tracker died, they had backup trackers ready to step in. When their primary toolmaker was injured, secondary toolmakers could maintain production without interruption. When their lead negotiator was killed in an accident, other community members could handle diplomatic relationships with neighboring groups. This redundancy wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate training programs that ensured critical knowledge was distributed across multiple individuals. They had learned through bitter experience that communities dependent on individual expertise were communities waiting to die. The psychological sophistication required to maintain these systems was extraordinary. Human nature tends toward specialization and hierarchy. We naturally develop expert roles and defer to acknowledged leaders. The successful groups had to fight against these instincts to create more resilient organizational structures. They developed cultural practices that prevented the formation of irreplaceable individual dependencies. They rotated leadership roles to prevent any single person from becoming indispensable. They established teaching requirements that forced experts to share their knowledge rather than hoarding it for personal advantage. But maintaining these systems required something that most groups couldn't achieve. They needed productivity levels high enough to support the apparent inefficiency of cross-training multiple people in the same skills. They had to be so good at basic survival that they could afford to invest in seeming redundancies. This efficiency came from relentless optimization of their core processes. While other groups hunted through trial and error, the survivors had systematized hunting into predictable, repeatable procedures. They understood animal behavior so thoroughly that they could anticipate movements days in advance. They had identified optimal hunting locations, times, and techniques that maximized success rates while minimizing energy expenditure. Their food processing techniques were equally refined. They had discovered methods for extracting maximum nutrition from every kill, utilizing parts that other groups discarded as waste. They had developed preservation techniques that extended the useful life of perishable resources. They had learned to combine different food sources in ways that enhanced overall nutritional value. These efficiency gains weren't just technical improvements, they were the foundation that made everything else possible. The time and energy saved through optimized basic survival processes could be invested in the redundancy systems, innovation programs, and long-term planning that separated survivors from casualties. The territorial strategies employed by successful groups reveal another layer of their sophisticated thinking. While failing communities treated the territory as fixed assets to be defended at all costs, the survivors understood that territories were dynamic resources that needed active management. They developed detailed knowledge of resource cycles throughout their territories. They knew which areas would be most productive during different seasons. They understood the migration patterns of prey animals and the fruiting schedules of important plants. They had mapped water availability throughout their range and identified backup sources for drought periods. This territorial intelligence allowed them to optimize their movements throughout the year. Rather than camping randomly or staying in familiar locations regardless of conditions, they positioned themselves strategically to take advantage of resource peaks while avoiding resource bottlenecks. But their most sophisticated territorial innovation was the development of what we might call territorial portfolios. They didn't depend on single territories for all their needs. Instead, they maintained access to multiple different territory types that provided complementary resources and backup options. They might have primary territories that provided their basic needs during normal conditions, secondary territories that could support them during resource shortages, and tertiary territories that offered specialized resources or strategic advantages during specific situations. So there you have it. The brutal mathematics of human survival 200,000 years ago, where 99% of our ancestors' communities simply vanished into the darkness of prehistory. But that precious 1% who made it through didn't just get lucky. They cracked the code of systematic survival, developing strategies so sophisticated they seem almost impossible for such small groups operating on such thin margins. Their legacy isn't just that they survived, it's that they proved intelligence, cooperation, and long-term thinking could overcome odds that would make winning the lottery look like a sure bet. Every time you face a challenge that seems impossible, remember these forgotten masters of survival. They built the foundation for everything that followed, and their greatest lesson remains as relevant today as it was 200,000 years ago. Sometimes, beating impossible odds isn't about being stronger or luckier. It's about thinking systematically and refusing to accept that failure is inevitable.